Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. Tensions are building between Owen County and some of its residents. Why a disagreement over a gun range is leading to legal action.
Precision gun range prides itself on being a safe range.
Plus, if you think it's hot now, just wait. We examine what a climate report says about the future for Hoosiers. And we look at the life of a Hoosier astronaut whose sacrifice was the first small step in getting Apollo 11 to the moon.
I have a letter from you that even states, had that fire not happened, he said we wouldn't have made it on time, and we all know that.
Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg has a lot of money. He outraised all candidates in the crowded Democratic presidential field with a nearly $25 million second quarter fundraising haul. But now he needs to use that money to build a campaign that can go the distance against nearly 24 rivals. Buttigieg spoke last night at the Young Democrats of America's National Convention. It was his first Indianapolis campaign stop since he officially launched his presidential bid. He acknowledged his need to build up his name recognition with voters across the country, but he says building relationships with voters and his clear message sets him apart in a crowded field. Indiana University political science professor Marjorie Hershey joins us now. Thank you so much for being here.
Welcome.
So Buttigieg has raised more money than some of the big names. You think about Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Are you surprised?
Yes. I
so
think
why?
This is historic. Well,
yeah.
When a young gay mayor of a medium-sized Indiana city outraises everybody else in the Democratic field, you know that he's found a new group of donors. And that new group of donors apparently has reasonably deep pockets. Now, these are not big contributors. The rules still involve a limit of $2,800 per contribution directly to a candidate. But those relatively small contributions look like they can keep coming.
You know, he was met with chants of Black Lives Matter and criticism of his record, you know, with the African-American community. And I think he has a plan called the Douglas Plan, the stated mission to dismantle racist structure and systems. Now, will that be enough to win back black voters?
Lots of candidates have lots of plans, and most voters really aren't aware of the details of any particular plan. Instead, I think what most voters look for is a more general sense of whether or not the candidate has a feel for people like them, understands people like them.
Mm-hmm. We also saw this week President Donald Trump turned his criticism toward Buttigieg. Is that kind of a sign that he's rising to the top of this crowded Democratic field?
It's, I don't have a very good track record of predicting what President Trump thinks, but given that he mentioned Buttigieg twice yesterday, first positively, second negatively, that suggests to me that at least somebody in his campaign is concerned about Buttigieg, and that was one of Mr. Trump's talking points.
All right, thank you very much for being here. Of course, much more on this subject as the season goes on. Thank you. Now for headlines, we go over to Barbara Brosier, who has the latest on this week's top stories.
Thanks, Joe. Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill says he won't appeal a federal judge's recent decision to temporarily halt the state's latest anti-abortion law. The law largely bans dilation and evacuation abortions, or D&Es, the safest and most common procedure for terminating a pregnancy in the second trimester. A judge ruled last month that the new law unconstitutionally denies women access to D&Es and stopped it from taking effect. Attorney General Curtis Hill says he won't appeal that decision. The latest ruling marks the 7th Indiana anti-abortion provision halted over the last 9 years. Governor Eric Holcomb has officially launched his re-election bid. As Sean Hogan reports, Hoosiers from all 92 counties attended the ceremony.
Hundreds of Indiana residents packed the Knightstown Hoosier Gym, where the classic 1986 sports drama Hoosiers was filmed, to support Governor Holcomb's bid for re-election. Holcomb began the rally by marking off a list of achievements he and his staff have tallied so far.
From the economy to job creation to infrastructure to public health to education, all the above, we are making such a positive difference in people's lives.
Holcomb acknowledged his work on finishing I-69 ahead of schedule, tackling the opioid crisis, and reducing infant mortality rates. But the Indiana economy took center stage, where Holcomb claims the state is really winning.
You just heard the state auditor a couple days ago talk about our record high reserves. Our reserves are up, our exports are up, our state GDP is up.
No elected Indiana governor has lost a re-election bid since the state began allowing second terms in the 1970s, and it's unlikely Eric Holcomb will break the trend. So far, the only Democrat running for governor is the former state health commissioner Woody Myers. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Sean Hogan.
The U.S. Department of Labor is granting Indiana between $1.5 million and $4.7 million to combat the ongoing effects of the opioid crisis. It will create disaster relief jobs to treat drug use and addiction. Indiana's Department of Workforce Development received a dislocated worker grant, commonly used after large layoffs or disasters, to help reemploy workers. It plans to serve about 450 people in areas of southeastern Indiana hit hardest by the opioid crisis. Well, city and county leaders are still trying to figure out how to move forward on Bloomington's Monroe Convention Center expansion. Mayor John Hamilton says he's frustrated with the delay in getting a memorandum of understanding from the county, while county officials are wondering how the city plans to come up with another $30 million for the project.
The original $30 million expansion estimate did not include a parking garage and the acquisition of land north of the current location. A report indicates the estimate to be closer to $60 million. Hamilton says the Bunger and Robertson lot created a great opportunity to bring the convention center closer to the downtown square. He says the city is looking at ways to fund the other costs.
A new hotel, if it comes, would be primarily privately funded, which is what we've expected, but there could be partnerships with abatement. Tax abatement is another option to look at for these kinds of things. But all that's in flux. There's no proposal yet in place. There's no design yet in place.
He says other funding options include tax increment financing and selling some of the existing property that's not needed. County Council member Cheryl Munson says convention centers usually carry a deficit, so taxpayers shouldn't be concerned.
But in truth, all convention centers have deficits, and the deficits are balanced against the revenue that comes in from increased taxes and from visitor spending.
Munson says the key component is the MOU that the city and county must agree upon for the project to keep moving forward. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Joe Wren.
And Joe, Commissioner Julie Thomas told us that the commissioners wanted more information from the architects, and we're working through some of the consultants' responses.
Yeah, apparently they were going back and forth with no progress. Hopefully they'll take that new information, draft another MOU. She said they should have that in the next several weeks. We'll have to wait and see.
Keep our eye on it for sure.
Thank you, Barbara. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. We head to Owen County for an ongoing dispute between a gun range and nearby residents. And the nation is looking back to 50 years ago when we put a man on the moon, and we look at the Hoosier who helped make it happen. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The The WTIU-WFYI News Team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU-WFYI News Team is where you are and telling your story.
$10,000.
15? 15, you think?
20, 21,000?
600.
20. 18.5.
24.
It's at least 40.
Look at it.
4,500,000.
650.
20.
650.
This textile would be worth about $500,000.
$500,000?
No way.
I knew it's just a blanket.
Laying on the back of a chair. Well, sir, you have a national treasure.
Wow.
A national treasure. Congratulations.
I can't believe this.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. Neighbors living behind a controversial gun range filed a lawsuit against Owen County this week, alleging the county hasn't done enough to protect them for what they say are unsafe practices at the range. Adam Pinsker tells us the plaintiffs say the county is allowing the range to violate its zoning ordinance.
Can we turn the lights on for you?
A seasoned rifle instructor, Kim Bartlett, gladly shows off the improvements she made to her gun range, Precision Gun Range, just outside Spencer.
Precision Gun Range prides itself on being a safe range.
But residents living along Hardscrabble Road, about a mile from the range's location on Wood Drive, don't see it that way. Two couples say their yards, homes, and trees are dotted with bullet holes that came from Bartlett's range. Bartlett says those bullets came from somewhere else.
Any given day, you can sit out here when there's no shooting going on, and you can hear the gunfire coming from the south, the east, the west, the north.
Bartlett says she brought in two ballistics experts who backed up her claim that the bullets did not come from her range. In March of 2017, David and Brozier Drake and their neighbors Kathy and Jerry Wise filed a lawsuit against Bartlett. They told us shortly after that bullets first began hitting their house in July of 2016.
And we heard this wheel thump. And we looked at each other and said, "Is that a bullet?" And so I went down and talked to them. And that was the first incident.
Since there's a second suit, their attorneys are advising them not to talk to reporters, but this week they did show us where bullet holes pierced their garage. Bartlett says she's taking these concerns seriously. She closed the rifle range twice in the past few years.
It goes all the way across.
During that time, she added what's called a baffle to the range that can deflect stray bullets.
The rifle bays themselves, on the outside, they're steel over the top, steel and plywood in between each window.
She also had the berm at the far end and left side of the range raised to ensure no bullets could fly over them.
If I am allowed to speak without one of their lawyers jumping up ahead without being recognized.
Weeks after a public hearing in May, the Owen County Board of Zoning allowed Precision to reopen despite objections from many residents who felt the safety improvements weren't enough.
I've been a shooter all my life. I was taught from a young age, and the number one thing that you're taught is don't ever shoot towards a house.
The Wises say another bullet from Bartlett's range hit their home days after the reopening, which is why the Drakes and Wises say they're now suing the county. Their attorneys claim Precision is violating conditions of their zoning by running an unsafe range. They want a judge to force the county to take action.
It only takes one to kill me, to kill my daughter who's going off to college.
But the county's attorney says public sentiment is not taken into consideration when the zoning board makes its decision. It's based solely on legal precedents. Bartlett says she's done absolutely everything she can to make the range safer and ease the concerns of residents.
They just don't want us here. They will say all day long they don't want to shut us down, but they do.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Adam Pinsker.
For now, the range is continuing to operate. A trial for the civil lawsuit filed against Precision is slated to start in January. That's according to the plaintiff's attorney. Owen County officials would not comment on the lawsuit against the county. Well, it's hot right now in Indiana, and it's only going to get hotter. The Union of Concerned Scientists released a new report this week that projects how much extreme heat we can expect as the Earth warms. With us to make sense of this report is Janet McCabe, Assistant Director at the Environmental Resilience Institute. Janet, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
The fact it's getting hotter is probably a little bit of an understatement right now.
I think.
A good time to talk about this.
Great,
Let's just start with health.
Yeah.
How does it affect Hoosier health?
Yeah, well, this timing couldn't be better, right, for this study from the Union of Concerned Scientists, because we're in the middle of a huge heat wave. At 6:15 this morning was 80 degrees in Indianapolis. Heat can have significant impacts on people's health. Heat cramps, heat stroke, even death. And in particular, people who have to work outside, people who are young, people who are old, people whose health is compromised already are at significant risk.
And what about agriculture? I mean, you know, and the farmers, the huge industry here in Indiana.
Right, for sure. And this UCS study comes on the heels of a study that was done in Indiana about these very things, which concluded that, for example, corn yields in Indiana can be expected to go down by 16 to 20% later in the century due to the impacts of extreme heat caused by climate change.
And then what about other, besides agriculture, what are some of the other big impacts that Indiana could see?
Well, we're seeing more ticks and disease-bearing mosquitoes come further up into Indiana as it gets warmer. It's more comfortable for them. Vegetation is changing. There are armadillos in southern Indiana now. That means that our climate is changing to be compatible for that kind of creature. There are impacts on infrastructure, road surfaces, bridges, things. We're not used to living in this kind of heat. Our housing is built for a different kind of climate. So it's really important for people to understand what's coming and to do what we can right now to make it not as bad and to be ready for it.
Well, we have 30 seconds, and that's why I wanted to ask, you know, there's either adapt or change. What can we do?
Both.
Yeah.
Both. We have to reduce our emissions of carbon. Carbon is like a blanket around the Earth, and if you put on a second blanket, what happens? You get warmer. So the more carbon we put up there, the warmer we're going to get. But we also need to be ready. The mayor today was calling for churches and other organizations in Bloomington to be available for cooling centers. We need to build those kinds of things into our system and have policies that will include and incentivize renewable energy efficiency, and clean practices.
Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
Solar panels are covering more roofs than ever here in Bloomington. As part of a partnership the city has with the Renewable Energy Group, solar panels are set to be installed on 12 homes by the end of this year. Now, as part of our City Limits series, a resident asked us to look into why, with all the city's efforts, IU hasn't followed suit.
In 2017, the City of Bloomington launched a program called Solarize Bloomington, an effort to make solar energy more accessible to its residents. Initially, around 500 residents came to hear about the program. By the end of this year, Bloomington could have over 200 total solar installations. The city took action when it did because of a change in Duke Energy's net metering prices. If panels were installed after December 2017, residents would get less money for the excess energy they delivered to the grid. With renewable energy efforts growing in the city, resident Jake McKinley started to wonder why Indiana University hasn't taken similar initiatives. He works for IU and has had solar panels on his home since 2014.
I think ever since then, when I see roofs, I see opportunities to put up solar panels. And as I go around campus, and especially as solar panels have sprung up all around the city, I just see, you know, these empty roofs on campus.
According to IU's most recent sustainability report, there are 4 solar power systems installed on rooftops across the campus. Bloomington has 31 municipal sites with solar installations. The university's decided to take a different approach. IU has focused on energy efficiency first.
You know, the city has, I'm guessing, and I don't work for the city, they have less building infrastructure and less sort of maintenance and upgrades that are possible in terms of energy efficiency. And those have, a lot of those have really, really fast payback financially.
He says this makes sense because the university has over 800 buildings across the statewide system. Predmore says these efforts are paying off. IU's energy use per square foot is about 18% less than it was in 2010.
So all those investments, those are things that people may not notice. They're things like LED lighting, investing in building controls.
In the last year, IU installed a new software called Energy Cap, which monitors the energy performance of all of IU's buildings.
We're really going to be able to look at the performance of our buildings and say, here's an outlier.
The landscape of renewable energy is changing rapidly. Just last month, Duke Energy announced a program where it would lease solar panels out to an organization. Predmore says IU needs to consider programs like this.
There's a lot of change right now and a lot of things that are a lot of new possibilities, and I think IU is committed to exploring those as the financial case looks better and better.
They also agree that IU and Bloomington should partner on sustainability initiatives when possible. While the university is making strides, Predmore acknowledges that for someone like McKinley, who's concerned about climate change, progress might not be happening fast enough. McKinley says renewable energy should be made a priority right now, rather than waiting for when it's most economically beneficial.
That's not necessarily what I see as the end goal. I think even if you can alleviate the electricity costs of a single building, I think that's, in my mind, that's worthwhile.
He says solar panels are an improvement to structures that will eventually pay for themselves. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Benta Boutier.
We want to hear your questions about the changing face of Bloomington. You can join the conversation by going to WTIU.org/citylimits to ask your questions about the past, present, and future of the city of Bloomington. Well, 50 years ago today, Apollo 11 astronauts were making their final preparations to descend to the surface of the moon. Celebrations and remembrances are happening across the country, and we're looking back at Indiana's contribution to the lunar landing.
Purdue University is celebrating the moon landing with a public exhibit revolving around the personal papers of alum and first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. He and his wife, Carol, donated a large number of memos and artifacts to the university's Flight and Space Exploration Archives. The exhibit is comprised of parts of Armstrong's life before, during, and after the historic Apollo 11 mission. Some of the selected pieces include one of Armstrong's Apollo 11 training suits and his report card from Purdue. Much further south in Mitchell, locals are celebrating the Apollo mission by focusing on fellow Purdue grad and second man in space, Gus Grissom. He's credited with laying the groundwork for the moon landing with his work on Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo.
First man to fly in space twice. First man to fly a two-man spacecraft. First man to actually change his orbit, to actually show people that you can actually fly and navigate in space. Necessary to get to the moon. That's what Gemini was about, proving that we can navigate and do the things necessary to get us to the moon.
But before he went to space, Grissom started out in this small Mitchell home, now a museum that celebrates his life and achievements. After spending World War II as a clerk, Grissom moved back home to Lawrence County, married his wife Betty, and settled down. But he never got comfortable. So they moved to West Lafayette, where Gus got his engineering degree from Purdue before joining the Air Force. Not long after, his life went in another direction.
So in 1959, Gus was selected to be part of the original 7 Mercury astronauts.
Mercury was the first in NASA's 3 stages to get to the moon. Each mission was designed to get astronauts closer to the moon landing. After Grissom finished his Mercury missions, it was on to the next step toward the moonshot, the Gemini program.
He designed that cockpit, so much so that the astronauts called it the Gusmobile.
But the Apollo project was different. From the beginning, Grissom expressed reservations about the build quality. He was vocal with his criticisms of the program, going so far as to bring a lemon to let engineers know what he thought of the spacecraft.
He hung it on with a coat hanger, and he hung it on the actual spacecraft to tell them his dissatisfaction with this. It is a lemon.
And his fears were confirmed when, in 1967, 2 years and a few months before his fellow astronauts walked on the moon, his capsule caught fire, and he and 2 other astronauts died during a test.
They were pushing the technology. They were still using a pure oxygen environment, and simply they had a short inside the capsule, and with pure oxygen as a fuel, it just literally took seconds for it to cause the damage that it did.
But Steve Grissom says that fire changed everything with the Apollo program.
They redesigned that whole capsule. That whole spacecraft got redesigned from the inside out.
It was a wake-up call for NASA engineers. Neil Armstrong even wrote a letter saying as much.
I have a letter from Neil that even states, had that fire not happened, he said we wouldn't have made it on time, and we all know that.
He says were it not for that fire, there's a good chance Gus would have been on the first trip to the moon.
Deke Slayton mentioned in his book Deke, and Deke was the picker of the astronaut crews and flights and all that. He even made the comment in the book that Gus would have been the first man on the moon had that fire not happened.
Even with his life cut short, Gus's legacy lives on, especially in Lawrence County.
This weekend is Grissom Day, and we tie it to his first launch. And it's July the 21st, and that's his first launch in the Mercury program.
Locals will gather to celebrate the Hoosier who helped guide the moonshot from Mercury to Apollo, where 10 missions after he died, 2 men stepped off the shoulders of giants and on to the face of the moon. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Tyler Lake.
That's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIU-News.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Mallor Grodner Attorneys providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.